Well, hello, my fellow image bearers. Today we're responding to a video from Stephen Woodford of Rationality Rules as he reacts to Jordan Peterson and Stephen Fry on the issue of morality.
So let's say we're going to defend the values of the West to the degree that they're worth defending. Then we are making a claim that the inheritors of a particular tradition have something valid morally on their side, or we cannot defend that position. There's something that's happening in our culture that's not sitting right with you. Okay, how do you defend the damn culture against it without making the claim that we do have something of, let's say, higher value that is the consequence of following a particular tradition?
Yes.
Because without that, you lose the argument instantly.
So when it comes to morality, I have a tendency to open with Immanuel Kant's categorical and hypothetical imperatives, and the reason for this is because this distinction quickly dispenses with much of the confusion around moral statements. A hypothetical imperative is something that we ought to do on the condition that we hold a certain goal. For instance, we can say, if you want to increase human happiness, then you ought not murder. But if someone doesn't hold the goal of increasing human happiness, then this ought statement is unfounded. Whereas on the other hand, a categorical imperative is something that we ought to do unconditionally, without reference to any goal or end. For instance, you ought not murder. And the dialectical stance that Peterson is referring to is that since the religious, for instance the Christian, are convinced that they have categorical imperatives, that is, in the form of immutable and eternal commands issued by the Almighty, they are able to object to the actions of non-Christians in a way that the more relativist can't. Whereas the Christian can say to other individuals and cultures, you must do X, or you must not do Y, since to fail to do so is to violate God's categorical moral law, the relativist can only appeal to hypothetical imperatives. They can only say, if you want X, then you ought to do Y. Hence, the religious, or anyone who believes in categorical imperatives, have something off, let's say,
higher value.
And it's only because of this, so the argument goes, that they can truly defend their own moral actions, or indeed object to the immorality of other individuals and cultures. Now, there are many approaches to this charge, but here we're going to focus on Fry's, which we'll break down into 3 segments. Here's the first.
Because without that, you lose the argument instantly.
I mean, I think a lot of it is to do with the necessity that we all have of redefining it. We have to remember that morality is a question of manners. It is literally what morality means. That our parents and grandparents had a very, very different and very firm sense of what was immoral. If the word immoral was used in a newspaper or by a person, then that person's immoral. It would have a sexual meaning. It would mean that they lived with someone with whom they weren't married, or they lived with someone of the same sex, or that in some way they were philanderers or loose in their morals, meant entirely to do with the bedroom. These were the unforgivable behaviors of a generation that close to us. We can still hug them if we're allowed to in the garden in COVID times. That's how quickly morality changes. So the idea of the culture is a false one. There is no the culture.
So Fry's approach here is unconventional, in that rather than explaining how a moral relativist can critique themselves and others, he simply denies the crucial and implicit premise that the religious possess categorical imperatives. That is, even if it were the case that, say, Yahweh issues objective moral commands, it doesn't follow that we have eternal and absolute morality. It could be that 1, God updates his laws from time to time, or 2, that we don't actually know what God's laws are, and as a consequence, our conception of these objective laws are relative to our epistemic state, our knowledge of the world. These positions are, as we'll expand upon later, the only really viable theistic explanations as to why the holy books explicitly endorse acts that we now consider reprehensible, such as slavery.
So what are we really talking about? It seems to me that Stephen understands Peterson to be referring to individual biblical scriptural pronouncements or commandments, or the equivalent in some other religion. And I understand why he thinks this. Peterson does reference scripture quite a bit. But what examples does Peterson specifically give of what he thinks are moral non-negotiables? Well, he mentions that truth should be pursued instead of falsehood, and he mentions that the beautiful is more valuable than the ugly.
The beautiful is more valuable than the ugly.
Yeah. Yep.
Truth is to be sought after in opposition to falsehood.
Now, these are things that I think the Bible does reflect, but they indicate that what Peterson might be thinking of is the undergirding objective morality, not scriptural teachings about individual issues or practices that then get rolled into moral absolutes. So it's not so much about Stephen's hypothetical imperative versus scriptural absolutes. It's more about Stephen's subjective moral foundations versus objective morality founded in God.
Fry is effectively saying that we're all in the same boat, suffering the same relativistic waves, and that we need only look at our grandparents, be them religious or not, to recognise this fact. And indeed, the empirical evidence very much agrees with him. Consider, for instance, the natural phenomena of homosexuality. Between 2002 and 2018, the acceptance of homosexuality has skyrocketed the world over. In the UK, it's increased by 12%. In the US and South Korea, by an astonishing 19%. And for every one accepting Kenyan in 2002, there now stands 14. Indeed, in less than a generation, our views on this one topic alone have significantly altered. Further still, the aforementioned study found that in 22 of 34 countries surveyed, younger adults are significantly more likely than their older counterparts to say that homosexuality should be accepted by society. This difference was most pronounced, the authors continue, in South Korea, where 79% of 18 to 29-year-olds say that homosexuality should be accepted by society, compared with only 23% of those 50 and older. And so, when Fry says...
So the idea of the culture is a false one. There is no the culture.
He's absolutely correct. Our culture, like every other culture, with or without a religious component, is not some static entity that's been preserved over generations. No, it's relative to epistemic and socio-economic circumstances, and when we adapt, when our views change, the next generation of the religious are essentially forced to reinterpret their scripture to survive. Indeed, to give just one instance, despite acceptance of homosexuality going up in Kenya by 1,400% in a generation, the vast majority of Kenyans are still religious, and hence we're witnessing religious moral relativism.
So here Stephen points out that the moral beliefs of the average person in 2000 are different from the moral beliefs of the average person in 2021. And he calls this religious morality, and the quotes are important here. That term is doing a heck of a lot of heavy lifting in Stephen's case. What does religious morality even mean? It seems that in Stephen's mind, religious morality means something like the moral beliefs held by religious people at a particular time. But Peterson's point is that there are higher values, or to put it in my terminology, objectively true moral facts. And I would say that these are understood best if they're grounded in God's nature. Couldn't it be that there exists a higher morality, an objective set of moral facts that spring forth from God's nature, and that religious people just get some of these wrong? Of course. This doesn't even touch the deeper point. However, when religious or irreligious people are incorrect about a particular moral fact, even then, it's often motivated by undergirding moral objectivity. For instance, with the case of abortion. Now, we likely disagree if you're an atheist out there, because a high percentage of atheists are on board with a woman's right to choose, as it's often phrased. But think about it this way. Whenever a woman wishes to terminate her pregnancy, there is a virtue at play there, the virtue of freedom. We value freedom. We value the freedom to make choices like that about, say, our own bodies. But in this case, if it's possible that this fetus is a person that has personhood, well, in such a case, we have two competing virtues. We have, on the one hand, the virtue of freedom, which is a valuable thing. Then we have the virtue of life. And when we pit these two things against each other, the virtue of life, we would say, should come out on top. And so the point about all of this is that even when someone is putting forth a woman's right to choose, and I think in some cases that's done out of purely impure motives, but many people who advocate for a woman's right to choose are putting forward what they think is a good virtue, and it is the virtue of freedom. But what I think they're missing is that there's another virtue in play here, the virtue of life. But the point is, even when someone makes a bad or makes an incorrect moral decision, or is incorrect about the morality of a particular thing, it's still often undergirded by something that is objectively morally good as part of the motivation, like the virtue of freedom in this case. But in short, Stephen's point fails here because religious people get stuff wrong. But that doesn't mean that there's not actually a higher value, an objective morality that is based in God's nature and that we can learn about. This is why I think the phrase religious morality can be a little bit confusing in Stephen's video. I don't think he intended to do this, but it almost sounds at times like there's an equivocation between the morality that a particular group of people might hold at a particular time in a particular place and what God knows is true about morality.
What religion has been brilliant at, and it's needed to be, but so has science, is redefining what God is. What God was in 1400, God was capable of doing remarkable things. He was answerable for everything. And we worshipped him for it. A couple of hundred years later, a few things had been taken away from him, and we could answer for traveling the world and knowing it and discovering how the stars actually were not holes in a black cloth, but maybe were celestial objects and then a few hundred years later. And similarly, science, we use the word cosmos. Well, cosmos used to mean a very small sphere of a section of the solar system. And now it's some infinite thing. And there may indeed be dozens of them, millions of them. Who knows, according to string theory and quantum theory and all kinds of Schrödinger's number and all the rest of it. Everything is redefined in each generation. So what is left that is absolute? And this is where religion has an argument with intellectual progress, because it wants to hang on to something that it believes is eternal and permanent and utterly always true. But there is no such thing.
To give another illustration of Fry's point, consider Genesis 2:18, where God says, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." This verse, among many others, has been the justification for untold misogyny throughout Abrahamic history. To stick to Christianity alone, since this is the religion that Peterson tends to favour, let's read the words of one of the most revered and influential church fathers, St. Augustine. If it were not the case that woman was created to be man's helper specifically for the production of children, then why would she have been created as a helper? Was it so that she might work the land with him? No, because there did not yet exist any such labour for which he needed a helper, and even if such work had been required, a male would have made a better assistant. One can also posit that the reason for her creation as a helper had to do with the companionship she could provide for the man, if perhaps he got bored of his solitude. Yet for company and conversation, how much more agreeable is it for two male friends to dwell together than a man and a woman? If it is necessary for one of the two people living together to rule and the other to obey so that an opposition of wills does not disturb their peaceful cohabitation, then nothing is missing from the order we see in Genesis direct to this restraint. For one person was created before, the other afterwards, and most significantly, the latter was created from the former, the woman from the man. And nobody wants to suggest, does he, that God, if he so willed, could only make a woman from a man's side, and yet he couldn't create a man as well. I cannot think of any reason for woman's being made as man's helper if we dismiss the reason of procreation. Now, this is just a tiny sprinkle of Augustine's contempt for females, but he isn't alone in his thoughts. No, the history of religion is a history of misogyny. As another example, here's a few words from perhaps the most famous and celebrated Christian philosopher of all time, St. Aquinas. For good order would have been wanting in the human family if some were not governed by others wiser than themselves. So by such a kind of subjugation, woman is naturally subject to man, because in man the discretion of reason predominates. And to give just one more example, and honestly I could do this for days straight, here's a piece from Martin Luther, delivered by a contemporary theologian.
But then one moment Luther says, why are girls sooner mature than boys? That's his question. And he says, it's easy because weeds grow faster than roses. Well, I got 4 daughters. They had it with Luther's ever since then.
Indeed, trust the arrogance of men to so readily discount the wisdom of woman. Misogyny, of course, still permeates within society, and especially religious society, but Christians these days tend to interpret Genesis in a vastly different way to their predecessors, and so once again we have a clear instance of religious moral relativism.
God didn't change his morality. Similar to the last point, what evidence is there that God updated or changed his morality? The idea that there is an objective morality that springs forth from the nature of God is perfectly consistent with God giving a particular set of rules to a particular group of people, given their culture at a particular time, and then commandments that are not as stringent on a different group of people at a different point in time. The morality is still in play. And keep in mind, because it keeps coming up, that while Stephen is using this term religious morality, seems to be using it to refer to what groups of people who are religious at a particular time and place think about things, that is distinct, even if it's not always clear in Stephen's words. That has to be distinct from God's knowledge of objective morality. And it's not that we have no way of knowing God's morality. It's that just like any other realm of human inquiry, we investigate. We look into it. One of the ways with morality, and this is just the nature of it, is that we study this through introspection. We look at our intuitions about morality and what the intuitions of people around the world are about that morality. Of course, yes, we use Scripture, not just Scripture, but we do look as Christians for what seems to be the clear teaching of Scripture on particular issues. Next, Stephen argues that religious people have to change their morality to survive. And what I take him to mean is in order to attract adherents in the particular culture. That's the only thing I can make out of that. But if that's true, what does that really tell us? Does it tell us something about morality, or does it tell us something about culture? Culture has a heavy impact on the thinking of the people in that culture. That's just a reality. And since we've already established that religious people can be wrong, it's not surprising that the culture they're in would impact their moral beliefs. But it doesn't speak to whether there is an objective morality undergirding all of this. As for Stephen Fry's point that there isn't really the culture, that there are different people within this culture. And there are microcultures. We can cut the demographics up and we can study different people groups in different geographic areas and that have different similarities. So in a certain sense, yeah, it's true that you can't step into that same cultural river twice. But in a different sense, we can still talk about the river and that it seems to be changing course. Now, Stephen reads a bit of the Bible before running off to find quotes from Augustine, Aquinas, and Luther to reconnect that with Christianity and then argue that religion is misogynistic. The history of religion is a history of misogyny, he says. Wow. Well, how about this? The history of men is a history of misogyny. It is. Now, I realize that for many of you listening, you think that it's fairly easy to show that the Bible is misogynistic. But just taking the case that Stephen just made, what's more likely? That religion is misogynistic in general because there are people within that religion that have said misogynistic things, or that men in every tradition have said misogynistic things? I mean, what would the syllogism for this even look like? Something like, if religious men say misogynistic things, then religion is misogynistic. 2, religious men say misogynistic things, therefore 3, religion is misogynistic. The problem with that is we can play that game with any organization, club, movement, or party that has men in it. So whether or not someone can make a successful case about religion and misogyny, from the points that we've just seen here, what we're saying is something that can be said about any organization that has men. Kind of a mundane point. Now, Stephen then points to the fact that Christians have changed their understanding of the interpretation of Genesis, and he takes this to be a form of religious moral relativism. But why did Christians really change their opinion? Well, any particular Christian might have changed their opinions about Genesis for any number of reasons. But are there good reasons to change your opinion about your interpretation of Genesis, or is it just an attempt to fit within the culture? Well, here's what John Walton has to say about it.
People could not have interpreted the Bible this way because they did not have the information about the ancient Near East. Interpreters, even in the early church, longed to know more about the ancient world of Israel's context, but they had no resources. You know, the reformers would have longed to know about the ancient context, but they had no resources. Archaeology began producing such resources for us in the second half of the 19th century, but then it took a good 100 years for texts to be deciphered, translated, interpreted, dealt with in academia, and then, not to mention, starting to move into more public discourse. So in that sense, it's really only in the last couple decades that such information has been available for conversation. People before that just didn't have it.
So why did Christians change their view of, say, Genesis 1? We have better resources now to make the determinations about proper interpretation.
Today, pretty much no Christian upholds slavery, and further still, they insist that the slavery of the Bible is strictly good slavery, you know, indentured servitude that was totally and entirely volitional.
Slavery in the Hebrew culture was volitional.
It was voluntary means of working off debt.
It was not perpetual, is the other thing worth pointing out. So it didn't transcend generations.
It's not that slavery was endorsed by the Bible. It's that slavery is universal among human civilization until modern times.
If somebody had lost themselves to debt, it was basically like a type of bankruptcy law. They would enter into that voluntarily.
Now, I've debunked this apologetic sophistry in another video, and it really is grotesque sophistry. But for the purpose here, it's only necessary to recognize that contemporary Christians interpret verses that explicitly endorse slavery in a radically different way to their predecessors. For instance, these following verses unfortunately came in very handy for pro-slavery theists. Numbers 31, verse 17 to 18 commands that the spoils of wars are to be dealt with as follows. Kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman that have known a man by lying with him. But all the women children who have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. Gee, I wonder why. And Leviticus 25, verse 44 through 46 states that foreigners can be bought, sold, and passed down as inheritance, and that so too can their children. Further still, the New Testament offers no explicit condemnation of slavery, but in fact reassures it. For example, Ephesians 6, verse 5 states, Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart as unto Christ. And 1 Timothy 6, verse 1 states, Let as many servants as are under the yoke count their own masters worthy of all honour, that the name of God and his doctrine be not blasphemed. But today, verses like these are pretty much ignored by Christians, being hand-waved away as something that theologians have adequately dispensed with. But again, all that is necessary for Fry's point is to recognise that God's categorical, immutable, divine laws resemble moral relativism in all but name. Now, whereas the moral relativist can be somewhat sympathetic of what we'd consider immoral practices of our ancestors by respecting that they were a product of their time and circumstances, this sympathy cannot be extended to the religious. Since, as Fry puts it,
it's not true coming from a Catholic whose whole point is that they are eternally true, that their morality is as true now as it was when St. Peter founded the church.
He also brings up slavery in the Old Testament, and this is a serious issue that should give Christians pause, and I've been interested in this for a long time. However, people like Paul Copan have done a fantastic job with this, and it can't just be hand-waved away. But in the worst case, this wouldn't result in religious moral relativism, and I'm not granting the arguments that atheists make about this issue. But again, objective morality is not inconsistent with the notion that God could determine a set of laws for one individual group of people, one nation, given their context, how long the nation has existed, how serious the laws need to be in the early days of this nation, and having a different set of laws for peoples that live at other times. Different laws doesn't necessarily mean different morality. As for the New Testament passages on this issue, Jesus was ushering in a spiritual kingdom. His people were not to take up arms and attack others or lead some sort of slavery revolt and overturn this worldwide practice. The goal was to win converts for Jesus, to bring people in to this new spiritual kingdom. And that might mean functioning in ways that one doesn't anticipate. For instance, I shocked my daughter several years ago when I told her that if someone came to our house and my family was at home, I think I should protect my family if they were trying to do harm to my family. But if I'm at home alone and someone comes into my house and say wants my TV or my Xbox, I think that it might be the best thing for me, honestly, to allow myself to be defrauded this, to pick up that TV, to pick up that Xbox, and perhaps help this man carry it out to his car. Because this could actually be an incredible witness for the kingdom, because the TV, the Xbox, isn't as important as this image bearer's soul and him coming in to this spiritual kingdom. Now, this is not an invitation for people to walk all over you. As I say, if my family was there, I would feel the higher virtue of protecting my family, as I think I should, to the best of my ability to do something like that. But in the end, we are a sort of people that are peculiar, according to the Bible. We may allow people to defraud us in order to present the gospel effectively. Now, this is not an admonition for people to stay in abusive situations. It's just to say that throughout Christian history, we are told that we will be defrauded, we will be done wrong, and that in those circumstances when we can, we should be more concerned about the kingdom than we are even our own lives. And so when it comes to an issue like slavery in the New Testament, a time when, unlike now in the Western world anyway, there was worldwide slavery, it's not a surprise to find Christians talking about being defrauded in order to reach people with the message of the gospel.
When we wish to defend our own culture or object to another culture, we can do so through two broad methods. On the one hand, we can appeal to a hypothetical imperative that we, or our interlocutor, holds. For instance, we could say, look, given that we, or the culture we're referring to, has the goal of X, it is scientifically, objectively the case that we, or they, ought to do Y. This is a perfectly sufficient way to justify our culture or critique another, but it's not, as Peterson said, off.
Let's say higher value.
And on the other hand, a second way we can defend our culture or object to another is by appealing to a categorical imperative. For instance, we could say, look, there exists an immutable, eternal law that we must all do X unconditionally. Now, if you don't believe in categorical imperatives, then this option isn't open to you. But even if you believe in religious morality, then, per Fry's response, in light of empirical evidence, it's clear that you still don't have this option, because
there is no the culture.
Indeed, even just a glance at history reveals that religious morality changes over generations, and thus it's relative, and not just relative to exegesis. Now, be it relative due to God changing his mind, which renders all of morality as merely grovelling at the whims of a divine dictator, or be it relative due to epistemic discovery, that is, to give an example, that we thought slavery was perfectly moral for centuries on the basis that the good book incessantly endorses it, but only discovered later that it isn't, and further still, we might well discover in the future that actually slavery is okay. The result on both horns is effectively the same. The charge of not having access to this form of higher value applies to the religious and irreligious alike, and thus all frameworks are equalized. An objection that affects all worldviews is no more a problem for one worldview than it is another. Or to put this another way, when the Christian says, look, I can defend my culture because I have a set of categorical imperatives, we can say one of two things. On the epistemic horn, we can say, do you now? How can you be so sure you're interpreting the words correctly, given that your predecessors got it so catastrophically wrong on slavery and the status of women and homosexuals? That's some faith you have, I must say. And on the ontological horn, we can similarly say, do you now? How can you be so sure that God hasn't changed his mind, given that he did so before on slavery and the status of women and homosexuals? That's some faith you have, I must say. So basically, if I've understood Fry correctly, and in any case I would say this myself, religious morality is a scam. The notion that religious morality, be it Christian, Hindu or what have you, is eternal and absolute is arguably the most successful myth of all time, but the slightest knowledge of history enables one to escape the belly of the beast. Yet where does this leave us in terms of morality? Well, I personally think that Peterson has barked up the right tree here. As Peterson and others have compellingly argued since the time of Darwin, our psyche didn't evolve in a vacuum. Just as natural selection has etched the serpent motif into our psyche as a leviathan of the ages, so too has nature etched in us, or at least the vast majority of us, a set of values that can, indeed, be described as something of higher value than those we make up on the spot. We are, after all, a social species that's been sculpted by nature to survive through reciprocity. Morality isn't an arbitrary bug, no, it's an evolved feature. Jeremy Bentham correctly identified, by my lights at least, that nature has placed humankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, suffering and pleasure, and that it is for them alone to point out what we ought to do. And it's my thesis that when a theist is pressed as to why she's so eager to dance to God's laws, it will, at base, come down to her serving her sovereign masters of suffering and pleasure.
At this point, Stephen poses his question about religious morality and offers two possibilities. One, how can you be sure about your interpretation? And number two, how can you be sure God hasn't changed his mind as he's done in the past? Well, on that second question, as the slide indicates, no, I don't think God has updated or changed his opinion. No, God may require different rules regarding specific actions for specific nations, but this is not to change morality. As for the question of how can we know that we have the right interpretations, this is a process of discovery, as I've said. This is moral epistemology. The importance of this is the idea that certain themes, ideas, and commands in Scripture are tools for the Christian to make sure he's arriving at correct moral conclusions. But then we also think we can reflect on the moral beliefs that are intuitively obvious for us. We think that God has placed this on all people's hearts. It is through these means that one may pursue God's morality. I would argue that without this system, one may make wrong moral conclusions. That's why it's so important. And on the ontology side, moral facts are grounded in God's nature, truly giving us Peterson's higher values. But what is Stephen's moral framework, and how does it compare to the one we're describing? Well, as best I can understand his morality from this video and others, and I could be wrong, Stephen, and I'm sorry if I am, it seems that what he's doing is something like what Matt Dillahunty says about a chessboard, that you have the subjectively chosen goal of checkmating your opponent. The subjectively chosen goal is put into a game, and then there's an objectively better or worse way, given the rules of the game, of achieving that subjectively chosen goal. So do you have an objective morality? In the sense that there are objectively better ways to reach that subjectively chosen goal. In Stephen's case, I think it's something like well-being. So that's the subjectively chosen goal, and then there are objectively better or worse ways of reaching that goal. And he even says in this video, if you're not concerned with that, well, then you're not obligated on this moral system. But here's the thing. There are people who are not motivated by that. If individuals who don't have that motivation or think that it's perfectly fine to do things that are not in their own best interest or in the best interest of society or in the best interest of others, and their moral framework allows for this, then you're still left with the same problem you're seeking to overcome in responding to Peterson. And that is that you should be able to look at other people in other cultures and tell them that they're wrong, that they're morally wrong to do these acts. And so you're still left with the same problem, and it doesn't really give you a solution. Because what we have is a bubble over here where there are people in that bubble that believe the way Stephen does about morality. And then there are people over here that have a different bubble that's disconnected from Stephen's bubble. And they have these views about morality. Then you have these over here that have a different morality. And you can't really say about the people in the other bubbles that the way they're doing it is wrong. All you can say from one bubble to the next is, I don't like the way they do it. But you can't say it's wrong unless they're in your bubble and they've accepted your subjective goal. Then you can say you're objectively going about the wrong way of getting to this subjectively chosen goal, in this case, well-being. Because they'd say, I don't care if what I'm doing is objectively the wrong way to get to well-being. Who says I should care about well-being? And so this falls apart. What we're looking for is something that stands over and above all of these bubbles, that informs all of them, so that you really can say to someone who's doing horrible things to children, right? I'll just leave it at that for the YouTube algorithms. You really can say what they're doing is wrong. It is wrong. It's not that we think it's wrong on a subjectively chosen goal. It's that, no, it is wrong despite human opinions about it. And so I think when you understand that that is the concern, then you can try to take shots at objective morality all you want, and maybe you'll be successful, and maybe you'll show that there is no objective morality. I don't think you will, but you'll be no closer to arriving at a morality that is universally workable in this way. And it seems that that attempt is somewhat accepted, or that conclusion is somewhat accepted in that, hey, if they don't care about my view on morality, then it's not true that they should do X. In the end, Stephen indicates that what we should be concerned about is what actually happens to be true. And I agree 100%. And if Christian theism turns out to be true, then it is on that view that you should, I'm using the word should here, commit to this God and follow his morality.
If it is the case that the God of Abraham exists, then following his laws is indeed what we ought to do, given our ingrained hypothetical goal of maximizing our well-being.